Hello, folks, and welcome to week 2 of the Roman world. This is going to be a bit of an info dumpy lecture, so kind of buckle up, get yourself a drink of your favorite beverage, and let's talk about Roman religion. Now, here I'm focusing on the part of religion that we call ritual. This is what my mother used to call the going to church part of religion. So this isn't the stories about the gods that you get in mythology. This is more about how do you interact with the divine on a day-to-day basis? How does your government interact with the divine? And how do you weave that into the rituals of patriotism in your society? So all that is what we mean by ritual, the stuff you do on a daily, monthly, yearly basis to make sure that the gods don't smite you as much as they might feel like smiting you on any given day. If you've met the Roman gods, you might understand. Okay, let's start with the big names in Roman religion. I'm just kind of work my way down this list. So this is a good time to, sit back and listen. I'll tell you when the pictures become a bit more relevant and important. Okay, so the big two at the top are also at the top of the pantheon. This is Jupiter and Juno. Jupiter is a weather god, a god of thunder and lightning and general up in the sky looking down on you and judging things. Now, in mythology, you may be aware of Jupiter's multiple extracurricular activities. These don't really feature into the ritual aspect of Jupiter, however. For the Romans, Jupiter is a god to cultivate for reasons of his power and his bigitude, his greatness. And this is why their temple to Jupiter is Jupiter Optimus Maximus. In the early years of Rome, it's a bit aspirational, but Rome always seemed to have this focus on bigness equals success. Pretty common focus. In fact, one that's so ingrained in our culture that we don't kind of stop to ask ourselves, is big always ideal? And that's a question we really should be asking of ourselves. All right, so the name Jupiter itself may not look like the name Zeus, which is the Greek equivalent of this god, but it actually is. So if you say Zeus Pater, which is both Greek and Latin for Zeus the Father, try it a couple of times fast, and then you get Zeus Pater, Zeus Pater, Zeus Jupiter. Trust me on this one. So Jupiter is actually Zeus Pater. This was an early development in Roman religion where what we think happened is that a local weather deity called Jove, 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 became associated with the Greek god Zeus as Greek speakers moved into the Italian peninsula. And this is a process that happens regularly in the Mediterranean. If you've ever wondered, how did multicultural Mediterranean people deal with the undeniable fact that people in different parts of the Mediterranean call the gods by different names? This is something that comes up in the otherwise abysmal series Britannia on Amazon Prime if you have some time to fritter. They do get the casting right for the Romans. They're at least brown enough, so gold star for that, but that's not how Druids work at all. It's just, it's a mess. And also you don't make leather armor like that. There's no point. Okay, right. So back to Jupiter and Zeus. So the way that ancient people dealt with this theological mismatch is that they figured, okay, the gods are the gods everywhere you go, but they have different names because people speak different languages. So how you get to know somebody else's culture is you sit down with them and you're like, okay, tell me about your gods, and I'm going to figure out which of your gods goes with which of my gods. And this is a process called syncretism. So if you have a good match, if you're like, oh, cool, you've got a weather god too, who lives in the sky and makes lightning happen, and that makes the crops grow. Oh, groovy, awesome. Then we're going to call that god the same god. So what happens with the Romans is that their god Jove gets identified with Zeus pater, and then they start using the names interchangeably, and you end up with a situation in Latin where Jupiter is only Jupiter in the nominative case. So when he's the subject of the sentence, when he's any other case in a sentence, he's Jove, which really irritates Latin students. Some of you have been irritated by this in the past, I'm sure. So Juno, the process is a little bit less complete. Juno was identified early on with Hera, but there doesn't seem to be any slippage in the name. So what they do is they just say, okay, Juno is the translation of Hera, and where Roman Juno may have had a little differences with Greek notions of Hera, those differences get smoothed over and chalked up to, the gods are the same people, but when they hang out in a different country, they meet different people and they have a different history with that people. Just like with normal human beings, right? You might be a different person with your cousins than you are with your parents, than you are with your grandparents, than you are with your school friends or your work friends. It's a different version of you. So for the gods in ancient Mediterranean mind, okay, the same thing. So Juno is a little bit less neurotic and a little bit more dignified in Rome, although it's questionable. They're essentially the same. Venus is another one of these who is close, pretty darn close to Greek Aphrodite. Aphrodite, by the way, is a composite made up of a number of Near Eastern goddesses, including Ishtar, Cybele, maybe also some form of Artemis. It's all very muddy, and I'm not going to get into that rabbit hole. Suffice to say, Roman Venus is perhaps a little bit less chaotic neutral than is Aphrodite. Greek Aphrodite, really enjoys just messing with people because she can, and she really likes using her power to create lusty feelings to wreak havoc. Venus is a little bit more chaotic good. She still causes trouble, but it's a bit coming from a place of she's trying to help. And some of that is because one of Rome's mythological founding figures is Aeneas, who is Venus's kid. So Romans thought that they themselves were descended from Venus, including like one of the most prudish Romans of all time, the Emperor Augustus, like made horribly restrictive laws against adultery and had this weird relationship with people reminding him that he was descended from Venus. And he's like, yeah, but not the cheat on your wife kind of Venus. It's just kind of one of the things Venus does. So, oh, Augustus. And then people would make fun of him for this, and then he'd get really mad and exile them to islands where they starved to death. Augustus isn't that fun. You'll meet him later, so stay tuned. Similarly, Mars is the other founding deity of Rome. One of Rome's other ancestors, and actually two, Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, are descended from the god Mars. So when Romans thought about who they were and who was important for them to maintain a relationship with, even though Jupiter and Juno, they spend a lot of time worshiping because they're powerful, and Romans are, well, turned on by power, not gonna lie. Venus and Mars are the gods that they look at as like great grandparents and grandparents. And that comes with a lot of tension because Mars is the god of war. Now, the god Mars isn't an exact match with Ares. So Ares is the Greek god of bloodlust. So he's a war god in the sense that he's a god of the rage of war, the fog of war, the kind of loss of control that makes you into this they kill or be killed monster. Roman Mars is not like that. Roman Mars is all about discipline and battle and focus. And he's not the only war god in Rome either. There's also Bellona, who is a native Italian goddess of war, who it doesn't get completely synced up with Athena, and that's interesting. She's worshipped as her own thing. Roman Athena is Minerva. Rome likes war so much they need multiple gods for it. And knowing their neighbors, I understand. But this means there's a little bit of tension. Now, interestingly, in Greek mythology, Venus and Mars are lovers. They're not married. Venus is married to somebody else, Hephaestus, the god of the forge and craftiness and robot manufacturing. Yes, really. But she's just not that into him. She likes Mars. She goes for bad boys. And she's like this force that can kind of get Mars to settle down and not murder so many people. So that's an interesting tension that lies in the founding myth of Rome, and something that we're going to see Romans touching on as their history progresses. Because Rome has a little bit of a love-hate issue in their cultural psyche, as it were. They go in for war in a big way, but they also think of themselves as people with big feelings and big hearts. And they're constantly wrestling with this tension between trying to build coalitions and bring people together, and also killing them for strategic reasons. Sometimes the same people at the same time. And oh, if you think that Romans are exceptions to this rule, no. One of the biggest killers of Romans are other Romans. Civil war is going to be a major theme. And when Romans kind of cope with, like, why are we so bad at having civil wars, or rather good at having civil wars, and that's also the problem. One of the things they go to is like, yeah, we're descended from both Venus and Mars, so we love each other, but we hate each other, and we love each other, and we hate each other, and it just makes us kill our relatives. But one of the interesting things is this is already present in the earliest moments when we have Romans telling us stories about themselves. So if you're a little kid growing up in early Rome, this is already going to be a story that you're hearing. And it's going to be part of how you think about your national identity and your place in the cosmos. It's interesting. I mentioned Vesta a bit before. I'm not going to say too much about her, but because she is the source of all of the hearth fires in Rome, she's one of the most frequently worshipped gods in Rome, which is interesting because she doesn't get a lot of press attention, a lot of stories. There's a lot of tension about this, but oh my goodness, you ignore Vesta in Rome at your peril. The institution of the Vestal Virgins is one of the things that Romans take incredibly seriously. And it's something that they think of not just as a religious feature, but also an important part of their civil service, their infrastructure. And it's something they identify with heavily when they think about what Roman honor looks like. And the fact that Roman honor at its hearth and heart wears a woman's face is really interesting. And we see, I think, impacts of this down the road in the relatively greater freedoms and rights afforded to Roman women compared to women in other societies around the Mediterranean. Although Rome is not alone at all in this. Women's rights are unevenly distributed in the Mediterranean region, and honestly, if I had to pick my place to be a woman in the ancient world, I'd go for Egypt or ancient Turkey before I'd go for Rome, but Rome would be like number 3 on the list. Really, Rome in North Africa, that's a sweet spot. Okay, now we're into gods you may not guess, first off, and probably didn't hear too much about in mythology class. Castor and Pollux are demigods. So their father is Zeus, their mother's a mortal named Leda. Zeus was in the form of a swan at the time of their conception, so they hatched out of an egg, as you do. And These are hero twins. One of them was born mortal and the other one was born divine, but they're such close brothers that they decided to share their immortality. So they spend every other day either in the underworld or in Olympus, and they go together as a pair. These are gods who have a major temple in the Forum. It's also the office of weights and measures and market regulation, which is interesting and a bit random, but they're worth bringing up here. They're a big deal in Rome. You can't buy anything in the Roman Forum without Castor and Pollux getting involved. Next up are some that you just don't hear of when you're talking about myth, because these aren't actually names, these are categories of gods, but these are the kind of gods that you would pray to most frequently if you were an ancient Roman. And these are the lares and penates. I'm going to start with the lares. We've got a picture of a lar over here. I've got them labeled. This here is our lar. The lar is what a Roman would call the genius loci, the spirit of a place. So the lar is an animistic kind of religious construct, which is a little different from the gods we've been discussing. So far, the gods we've been talking about are anthropomorphic. That is, they look like people, they have people personalities, and they have faces, they have bodies, and you interact with them a lot like you interact with people, only they're god people. The lares aren't like that. So the lares are the spirit of a place. This is more what we call animistic. So animistic concepts of the divine believe that there's a divine spark in everything in the physical universe. There is a divine presence in springs, in mountains, in rivers. This is something that's in Greek religion too, so this isn't just Rome. Most Mediterranean religions have this element to them. So and nobody feels any tension about this. They're like, oh no, we have a hybrid religious system. That's bizarre. No, 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 no. This is normal for them to have different categories of gods. So the lares you'd worship because your house stands on top of them. So the lar in your house is the divine spirit that lives in the ground that your house stands on. And if your family owns that land, you're going to want to get really close with this divine presence because they're going to see you day in and day out. And they're going to be able to help you if your household comes into trouble. So when Romans tell stories about lares, sometimes the lares will hide things for family members. If you want to keep something safe and secret, you'll bury it underneath your household god, your lar. And that works out pretty well, at least in plays. They also happen in non-household spaces. So you'd often have items like this. So this is a freestanding altar to the lar of the roadside. And this is the lar, the spirit of this stretch of roadway. So this would have been put beside the road. And when you're going on a road trip, you'd stop and you'd pour a little bit of wine for the lar who lived there. So the lar who lived there would be like, thank you for buying me a drink, folks. I am totally going to watch out and make sure that the muggers don't get you, which is a real problem. Ancient roadways were full of organized crime, bandits, independent robbers, also wandering magicians and necromancers, also something you need to worry about. Serial killers who'd have been exiled from their home city would hang out by roadways to serial kill you some more. So don't skip the lar. In some ways, this feels like the Roman version of roadside attractions, like, the world's biggest potato. Maybe that's kind of like a lar. You stop there, you pay a little admission fee, and you see the giant potato. It's not that alien. Next up are the penates, or the penates. These are a little even more obscure than the lares. The lar we're pretty sure is the spirit of the place. The Penates, their name looks a little bit like the Roman word for the inside portion of the house. Romans used the space in their homes differently than Americans use space in their homes. We think of our homes as entirely private spaces. There are some spaces that we invite our friends to come into sometimes, but only our friends. We don't think of our living room as public space. This is not true for Romans. Romans accepted walk-ins if they were rich enough to have a living room, which is another problem altogether. The penitus part of your home is the private end. This is the bit that you don't let guests into, that people don't just wander around in. This is the private area. And there's usually a doorway walling it off. Fancy family houses, you can see a real demarcation line between the front and the back. These, we think, are the gods that represent the spirit of your family. And these are attached more to your, I don't say bloodline because people who are family by adoption count too, but these are divine spirits that are attached to your private family life, that watch over you in your most vulnerable personal moments, when you're at home, when you're dealing with each other. These are the gods that help assure you that somebody's looking out for you. They're a little bit like the concept of guardian angels in some kinds of Christianity. The idea that there's specific spirits that watch out for you as an individual or you as your loved ones. The other thing is they're always plural. You can tell you're looking at them because there are two of them, and they're usually carrying a spear and wearing a helmet. And that's who these folks are here. That's a coin with the Penates on it. Now, the Lares and the Penates go together as a unit, and sometimes Romans will talk about them in the same breath, like, oh, I'm making an offering to the Lares and the Penates, because they're both the household gods. And you worship them at meal times with little offerings. You pray to them on a daily basis. There's a little shrine, we'll look at those later, that you pass by on your way in and out of the house. So these are a part of your daily conversation with the divine, and a really big part of how you as a family unit think about your divine resources and commitments. One final note about the Lares, so moving back a little bit. Lares, although they are the spirits of a place, they can be moved. And we'll be talking about a very important movement of Lares when we talk about the other part of Unit 2. That is the story of Aeneas. So keep an eye out for them. They'll be back later. The next category of gods are what we call personifications. So these are gods that are both like the anthropomorphic gods, Jupiter, Juno. They have a body, they have a face, there's statues of them, you worship them. But instead of having a name and a job, like Juno's name, for instance, doesn't mean marriage. Juno is a goddess of marriage, but she's not got a name that most of the time is synonymous with marriage. And sometimes poets will do that to be cheeky, but not really. In this case, you have Latin words for abstract concepts that have been given a face and a body and a gender and are worshipped like gods, but they still have the same word that's a normal Latin word. And sometimes we, as readers of Latin, don't know if a Roman is talking about the god or the concept. And for Romans, there isn't any point in making the distinction because, yes, and the concept is the deity. So here are two examples. A lot of these tend to be feminine, interestingly. Concordia sounds like Concord, which is not just a town in New Hampshire. It's also the concept of getting along. So this is two Latin words. Con means together, like a convention is when you get together and cosplay with your buddies. Cordia is from cor cordis, like cordial. It's related to the word that gives us cardiac, but that's in Greek. So your core comes from this, like the core of an apple is the heart of the apple. So if you're concord with somebody, your hearts are in the same place. You are so getting along that you are just beating on the same heartbeat. You're on the same wavelength. So this is the personification of getting along, gosh darn it. And the goddess Concordia is somebody you would pray to when you are having trouble getting along with people. Her statue might be carried with priests of Concordia as a way of making sure that the goddess kept you from killing each other while you negotiated. So she is the goddess of conflict resolution. So these goddesses are sometimes more aspirational than they are literal. Pax is another one. Pacus is the Latin word for peace. Peace that is the cessation of violence, not necessarily peace achieved through diplomatic and non-coercive means. You can totally coerce somebody into Roman peace. In fact, that's kind of going to be a plot point for the rest of the semester. But the goddess of peace is the goddess of the relief at the end of violence. And she's another goddess that gets worshipped in Rome a lot because Rome has a distinct lack of this, both within and without. So that's what we mean by a personification. And there are a bunch more. This is just tip of the iceberg here, really. Next up are ancestors who are also deified. Romulus is an early example. So Romulus is that Mr. Rome dude who is the first Roman, or one of the first two Romans. He names the city. He's the first king of Rome. We're going to talk about him later because, he's got a history. But on his death, so legend has it, he's taken up in a cloud and he becomes a god. So he was also worshipped. He had temples, there were altars. You would pray to Romulus for the future of Rome. And this wasn't thought to be like a cut-rate god or anything. This has a long tradition in the Mediterranean where people who start as heroes, and hero doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing good things, it just means that you're doing things that people remember, which means that heroes can do some really awful stuff and still get deified and worshipped. So this is not necessarily an endorsement. And that's going to be really important with Romulus because, again, problematic. So when the first emperor of Rome dies, it is not necessarily as surprising as you might think that he's declared divine. In fact, he does it with his adopted father, Julius Caesar, so you end up with the divine Julius. So Julius gets worshipped as a god, even though, by Roman standards, mind you, ancient Romans thought he was a war criminal because he was a war criminal. Genocidal maniac. Good writer, genocidal maniac. In fact, him being a good writer is why it might surprise you to hear the words genocidal maniac associated with Julius Caesar. He still gets really good press, despite us having found the bodies from one of his mass genocidal incidents. So, we have a rare body trail for Caesar's mass extinction events. Nonetheless, the Romans deify him. You could get in trouble if you insult the godly godhood of Julius Caesar. And this wasn't something where Romans were like, that's not a real god. That doesn't happen. Mortal people don't get to be gods. I mean, some Romans did think that was silly. But for your average Roman, this was felt to be within the realm of normal religious practice because this person had done a memorable thing that was important for the state, and their memory becomes sacred to the way that the state now runs. We perhaps have a little bit of this in the way some people think about the founding fathers, especially George Washington, or maybe it's just me because I grew up some of my childhood in Virginia where there is some conspicuous fans of George Washington. I'm sorry, I don't count myself as one of them. That, like, jumping through legal loopholes so you can re-enslave your enslaved people is not okay, and I'm gonna kind of die on that hill. Just saying. Okay. Now, so far we've been talking about gods that feel very local to Rome. Even the ones that have been syncretized, that have been made to concur a little bit with their Greek equivalents, still feel very homegrown. They have Italian names. But Romans didn't see a problem with worshiping other people's gods if they found a god that they couldn't quite fit into their pantheon. So if they see a god who doesn't sync up with any of the local ones and seems to be powerful and important, Rome has zero problem with getting some soil from one of their main shrines, transporting it to Rome, and founding a Roman local shrine, and then worshiping that god. Now, sometimes this is less officially sanctioned than other times. For instance, Bacchus or Dionysus, when forms of the worship of Bacchus traveled to Rome, there was a lot of concern among Roman state officials, because when you worship Dionysus in the mysteries of Dionysus, you do it with equality between enslaved people and free people and men and women and intersex people. All of them together worship Dionysus as equals, and the Roman state thought that this was dangerous because they were worried about enslaved people rising up and rebelling against their enslavers, which, by the way, is a natural human reaction to being enslaved. But Romans were really worried by that, so they did try to tamp down on certain ways of worshiping Dionysus. But in other cases, Romans felt that it was the right time to bring a new god into the city. And sometimes they'd make a big deal out of it because it was like, hey, we stole your god. Romans are just kind of like that. So one of them is the good goddess, the Bona Dea, who's also called Cybele or Kubala. She's a Near Eastern mother deity who is also a defender of cities. More about her later. But suffice to say, she's not a Roman god. She's not a Greek god. She's completely out of that sphere, but well within the Mediterranean. There was apparently a plague in Rome at one point, and the Romans decided to solve this plague by reading the omens, and the omens seem to say, you need to get Cybele into the city. So they go, they get some dirt, they found the sanctuary of Cybele, the plague lifts, and boom, great, awesome. So Cybele worship becomes something that's state-sponsored, state-sanctioned, a big part of the Roman religious life. Isis is another one. Romans couldn't really figure out an equivalent to Isis. Juno doesn't quite fit. Isis isn't really a marriage goddess. She's a rebirth and rejuvenation goddess. She's a savior in desperate circumstances. Now, I don't think there's a moment where Romans decide to import Isis, but she was seen as fairly benign, and she was very trendy. So by the time you get to the 1st century BCE, Isis worship is a big deal in the city of Rome and the Roman world in general. And Romans saw absolutely no problem with that. In fact, Romans would be really offended if they tried to adopt your god and you got mad at them. And they were also really offended if they offered you their gods and you wouldn't worship them. And this was a real problem with monotheists, especially Judaism. And this is a repeating theme where monotheists come in contact with other people in the ancient Mediterranean, and they're like, hello, new friends, would you like a statue of Zeus for your temple? And the Jewish folks are like, no. And then first the Greeks and later the Romans are like, do you not like us? What's wrong with Zeus? So many things. And then they get like super butthurt, and then people died, and then the Maccabeans, and then Hanukkah. Suffice to say that for most people this worked out okay as a mechanism of tolerance, but it really failed to account for the religious diversity in the Mediterranean when it came to monotheists and also atheists. More about that to come. All right, so that's the end of the big slide. On to the next one. So let's talk about the how. First, public ritual. If you want to worship Roman gods, as I said earlier, here we are looking at the facade, the front porch of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. You don't go inside the temple in most circumstances. Instead, you bring your offerings, and for the big gods, it's usually an animal that you're going to ritually kill here. This is an altar space. You can see the bowls on top of it. That's for catching the blood of the sacrificial victim. But the entire animal isn't for the god. The bones and the fat, those you burn, and the gods like to smell that, and that's how they participate in the church barbecue. The people at the sacrifice get the meat, which they roast and then they eat. So it's like a big party that you have, and the gods are there. You share a meal. The gods like you. They're grateful to be included. And then your relationship is improved. Now, another thing that happens at these sacrifices is that the god comes down and accepts the animal. And for that reason, it was felt to be important to watch the behavior of the animal during the ritual. If anything doesn't go according to the script, that means the gods are trying to tell you something and you should listen, because if you don't, bad things happen. More in a minute. Also, when you open up the animal, because these animals have to be healthy, perfect, and young, if there's something funky going on with the innards, that's also a sign. So more about that too. Let's talk about the mechanics of the sacrifice. I mentioned that this happens on the altar. There's usually a fire going on the altar, and there's some burning involved. Sometimes you'll also have cups for blood. It was thought to be important to pick the right animal for the right god, and quality mattered. Often temples, especially enterprising temples, would sell pre-approved healthy young animals for use in sacrifices. You wanted to give the gods your best animals, so an animal that hadn't been doing hard agricultural labor, an animal that wasn't sick, that had a perfect coat, that was young, healthy, all of these things. Frequently there'd be a theme. If you're offering an animal to a god of the underworld, it would be a dark color. If you're offering to a sky god, like white color or spots, just depending on the god's preferences. Often female animals for female gods, male animals for male gods. You kind of get the idea. And it was really important that the animal be seen to consent to the procedure. Now, of course, like animals can't do informed consent. That's not kind of a thing. But the way that Romans would contrive this is that they would put some food in front of the animal, and the animal's head would dip to eat the food, and that was seen as like a nod, and they'd be like, okay, are you down for the sacrifice? And the animal would be like, no. And they'd be like, awesome, you're in for it. So then they would quickly and humanely kill the animal, because if the animal doesn't go down in one blow, that was seen as a horrible omen. If the animal suffered, if the animal bled in the wrong places, if the animal got a glancing blow and started to trample people at the sacrifice, all of this meant that the gods are not happy with you and you are in such big trouble. This is a specific kind of sacrifice we're looking at here called a suovetarilia, which is just a mashup of the Roman words for pig, sheep, and bull, because they're offering a pig, a sheep, and a bull. So this is a deluxe sacrifice, although not the most deluxe sacrifice, but yeah, this is pretty good. This person's going all out, which is probably why there's commemorative artwork. Often there's sacred trees around the temple, which is what's going on back here. You'll notice that the person making the sacrifice has their toga over their head. Everybody else is wearing greenery on their heads. That's another important part. Everybody, including the animals are wearing little wreaths. See, the pig's got a flower crown, the sheep's got a flower crown, the bull's got a little flower crown and some ribbons and some decoration. Yeah, so one of the jobs that you might have in ancient Rome was making these garlands and headbands out of different greenery and flowers. This was a big business, and you could make a pretty decent coin doing that. The times when we go about worshiping the gods in ancient Rome depend on the calendar. So the calendar is part of the religious life of Rome, both because the festival days of the different gods are on them, but also it's the priesthoods and the religious bodies who keep track of what day is what, when it's time to plant, when it's time to reap. So this has a very important regulatory, civic, and amenity function for the community, because it helps the farmers know when it's the right part of the agricultural year to do different agricultural tasks. The other thing that the calendar included were days where it was phos and nephos to do business. What do I mean by phos and nephos? A phos day is a day that the gods are fine with you doing business. It's cool. You can get married, you can buy stuff. It's good. Yeah, it's fine. So the word phos in Latin means it's okay. It's ritually fine. It's kosher. The gods are good with it. But it also has the sense of inherent rightness. So this is a day that has good vibes. The opposite to that is the nephos day, the nephosti, or the not phos days. So these are days where the markets are closed, you don't get married, certain sacrifices can't happen, the Senate can't meet. These are days that don't have good vibes. And you want to make sure you know when those days are so you don't do something important that can have financial and social ramifications on a day where the gods are already a little ticked off. And these include things like the anniversaries of major military defeats. One of the things Romans did is they'd make dark holidays out of these kinds of anniversaries. They called them a dies atra, which means a dark day. And this was a day that you definitely didn't want to get married on. And we kind of have these too. Most recently, September 11th, that's a dies atra. Heck, 2020 is kind of an annus atrus, or sorry, ater, it's third declension, annus ater is a dark year. They didn't have that. That's not a thing for Romans. They were kind of used to pandemics. Let's see what else. Yeah, Pearl Harbor Day is a little bit of a nephastus day. So all of this is kept on a large calendar in downtown Rome where the days would be marked. So if you weren't sure what day it was, you could go and look. And these are fragments that have survived of that giant calendar in downtown Rome. So here it is, the Fasti. We're looking at the Fasti. And these have the different days marked in order with their letters, with the months and the holidays, all the way down here. Carnea. Oh, here's the Lupercalia. So it's just abbreviated Luper, but the Lupercalia is Roman Valentine's Day, and it happens around Valentine's Day. Only instead of giving people chocolate and hearts, because chocolate's a New World dessert, instead, naked young dudes go running through the streets whipping people with rawhide wolf whips in order to make them fertile, especially ladies. So if you're a lady with fertility issues, you want to get out there on the side of the street so a young naked man could whip you. And that's Roman Valentine's Day. Sorry, that's funnier than it should be. Okay, so let's talk about the Roman calendar now, because this is something we still use. If these months look kind of familiar to you, that's because we're still working on this model. But for the Romans, this was a calendar in development with three major three major phases for the Romans, and then the modern here are in this column. Pull up my red pen. Where is it? Here we go. This column right here. So there's the modern. The original Roman calendar is in this column, and you'll notice they're 10 months because 10 is a nice even number in base 10 counting systems, which is what Rome was using in these very, very early days. So these are the first months Romans used, and this was traditionally dated back to 753 BCE, and it's known only in legend to the Romans we're going to be meeting. Romans talk about ye old Roman calendar used in the first days, but we don't have written records sufficiently coming from this period that we can confirm. So, we'll just take Roman historians' word for this here. So they tell us that the year used to start in Martius, which was the month of Mars, the ancestor god, so that makes sense. April, the word April is from Virilis. It's just grown in A in early days. And this is the man month. Virilis means manly, so this is the month of manly. Why is April the manly month, you may ask? Well, April is the month where you're doing your early agricultural work, you're out in the field, there's a lot of man work that you're doing, so I just go with it there. Maius, something for the ladies here. This is the month of May. We still call it this. It's Maius forever, and it's still Maius. This is named after Maia, one of the mothers of the gods. This is a primordial deity, and that's all I want to say about that, other than it makes sense. This is a growth month, so this is where you have the female months popping up. Next up, you have Junius, named after Juno. We've met Juno. There she is. She's got a month. We still call it June after Juno. So, yeah, that one stuck. Next up is Quintilis, which gives us one of the Roman first names you're going to notice. Quintus is a really common dude name for Romans, and it comes from this month. So in early days, if you were born in this month, they just call you like Quintilis. It's kind of ironic because eventually this month gets renamed after a person, Julius. So you'll notice the last iteration of the Roman calendar here. This is Julius Caesar's calendar. So in the year 46 BCE, Julius Caesar had instigated a military coup, took over Rome, got himself declared dictator for life, which is totally different than being a king, mind you. So different. And at this point, one of the things on his very long list of things that bugged him that he was going to fix now that he was in charge of the world was that the calendar was just really off. Romans had to keep adding this extra month to get the year to catch up because they didn't have a leap year. So Julius Caesar fixed that. He invented the leap year because the year isn't 365 days exactly. It's like 365 and a quarter days. So every fourth year you have to add a day to February. So if you hate leap years or you love them, thank Julius Caesar. But one of the things he did, because Julius Caesar had many things, but shyness was not one of his problems. Great self-esteem on this dude. He decided that since he was at it, he'd name the month Quintilis after himself, Julius. And we still call it July, because Julius Caesar, so July's named after a mass murderer. That's awkward. But I guess it's kind of on all the calendars, so we're stuck with it for the duration. Take care of the $20 bill first, and then let's try for July, shall we? Next up is Sextilis. Astute observers may have noticed that Quintilis is also close to the Latin word quintus, or quintum, rather. Quintus is the name. Quintum means 5, because it's the original 5th month, so it's 5 month number 5, which is why Julius decided to rename it. The first 4 months had god names on them, and even Julius Caesar wasn't so into himself that he wanted to take a god name off of a month. He wasn't there yet. So he waited until the month named after a number, and he figured the number wouldn't mind, so there we go. His adopted son and heir, the Emperor Augustus, retroactively named Sextilis month number 6 after himself, and we still call it that, August. Also problematic. So after that, we get into months that we still have numbered. So after month number 6. There's month number 7, which is called September, which is Latin for month number 7. October is from octo, meaning 8. So it's month number 8, and we still call it that. November is month number 9, and December is month number 10, like a decade. And if you've ever wondered, like, but December's the 12th month, why do we call it 10? This is why. The alleged earliest Roman calendar had 10 months, and December was the 10th. But very early on, like, we're still into Rome's mythological history here. King Numa, who's the second king of Rome, so Romulus is number 1, already the second king of Rome was like, okay, 10 months is just, the months are too long. Numa didn't like it, so he redid the year by adding 2.5 months. So the ones he added were Januarius, which is named after Janus, the god of beginnings and ends. He's a god with a head that has a face on the front and a face on the back. He's looking forward and back. The kind of New Year's baby and old man thing that we see at New Year's is derived a bit from this idea. So Januarius is also related to the Latin word for door. So it's the first month, it's the doorway to the new year. Februarius, a little bit more obscure, but it seems to be related to words for cold, winter, burr. So February. I guess Julius Caesar could have grabbed that one, but King Numa invented it, and King Numa was deified, so I guess Julius noped on that one. Now, I said in a half. Whenever the Roman calendar got too out of whack, because, again, this isn't a calendar that has the quarter day in it, they'd insert what they call a leap month or an intercalary month, where they just add another month randomly every once in a while. I'm an ancient historian. Ask me how irritating it is to deal with this. Really irritating. I'm an ancient historian with a math disability. Feel my pain for a minute, and then you'll understand how many feelings I have about this. So, like, even though Julius Caesar and I do not get along, and I am not endorsing anything he ever did, but I have the least problem with fixing the calendar. I get it. Like, he had a point. All right, so that's why the calendar looks the way it does. The Romans did it. They're responsible. So if you don't like the calendar, you know who to send your complaint off to. Okay, so the people in charge of all of this religious activity on behalf of the state were called flamines, is the plural. Flamen is singular, and that's the Latin word for a minor priest. So you wouldn't have just one priest of Jupiter. You'd have what they called a collegium, or a college, a collection, a fraternity of priests. A lot like with the Vestal Virgins, where they had Vestal Virgins in training, active Vestals, and then senior Vestals. The same thing would happen with Flamines. So you'd have babies getting trained, and then you'd have your middle-aged active Flamines, and then you'd have your older Flamines emeriti off advising you on how to do your rituals properly. Now, in charge of all of the priestly colleges in Rome was this dude called the Pontifex Maximus. If you're familiar with Catholicism, you may be familiar with this term because this is now the title used by the head of the Roman Catholic Church. It means the biggest bridge builder. Pont is still in French the word for bridge. Fex is from facio. It means to build, like an artifact. It's a complicated root. Let's not get into this. Just take my word for it. Pontifex means bridge builder. And the idea was the first person to hold this title was the same king that revised the calendar, that King Numa guy. And he was a king, a rex. And what he did was create regulations, including like figuring out how to run the religious life and the calendar. So is king with a heavy emphasis on the ritual title. And one of the things he did as king, apart from renovating the calendar and creating all of these priesthoods was he built a major bridge, a bridge that was apparently just a great bridge, the first bridge across the Tiber, which, yes, is a big deal if you happen to be Rome. Very swampy. Bridges are a big deal. But it's also about metaphorical bridges. So the Pontifex Maximus builds the bridges between all of these groups of clerics who run the various parts of the religious life of Rome. So this is the person who can resolve disputes between priestly colleges. This is somebody who can figure out who gets what land for what reforms are made to the calendar, whose festival is going to happen when and where, and who gets what budget. All of this stuff the Pontifex Maximus is in charge of. One of the more interesting people to have had this title in ancient Rome was Julius freaking Caesar. Again, this guy. He very energetic, I'll give him that. I kind of wish he wasn't, but there we are. You can tell you're looking at a flamen because they wear some very distinctive headgear. So this fellow has had his portrait done wearing this very tightly fitted skull cap, kind of these earpieces tied under his chin, and there are these straps coming up the side that connect. It's broken off on the sculpture, but you can see it here on this relief. There's this sort of weird, it almost looks like a top or perhaps a spindle stick, and it's attached to the headgear. We're not sure why, but this is a thing that a lot of religious folks do, is you put distinctive headgear onto the important leaders of your religious movement so you can pick them out in a crowd. You know that the gods really care about what happens to them, so you're going to watch your step a little bit. We have clergy collars and even skull caps that look a lot like this, again, in the Roman Catholic Church. It's Roman Catholic for a reason, and this has to do with, well, Romans, heavily involved, which would really horrify a lot of these ancient Romans. So I guess it's good they're dead. So next up, I mentioned that omens are a big part of what you would do in your day-to-day life as a religious worker in ancient Rome. One subset of this is augury. So this is religious bird watching. You watch the behavior of birds, especially where they're flying in the sky and how they're eating on the ground. And variations in the behavior of these birds are going to suggest to you what the gods are thinking, particularly sky gods. There's an idea that different gods are associated with different parts of the sky, so you could tell like which god wanted to tell you something, depending on like what kind of bird and what part of the sky. Also, what kind of bird tells you which god. For instance, Jupiter likes to send messages through eagles and vultures. He likes big birds, not Big Bird from Sesame Street. I don't know what Roman god would... I think that would be Juno. Juno likes geese and peacocks, and Big Bird seems to fall into that large theropod kind of bird category. So, let's go with that. But yeah, Juno has sacred geese. Sacred chickens are a good catch-all, maybe slightly associated with Mars, but again, chickens are a little generic. And this list goes on in increasingly granular detail. So what we see now is an augur. So augury is the practice of bird watching for religious purposes. The person standing at the center with this curved sticky thing is an augur. So that's a professional bird omen reader. And you can tell that he's at work because, well, there's a chicken actively pecking at the ground. So the chicken's eating. That's one sign. The next sign is that you see how his toga's been pulled up to cover his head? And also this Roman here, toga's over the head. Roman women always had, well, no, I'm going to back away from always. Upper class Roman women, when in public, would regularly put some kind of covering over their head, which is what's going on here. So it's less diagnostic for her. But if you're praying and offering sacrifice, you put your toga over your head first. And you do this for a couple of reasons. First, you want to cover your head in the presence of the gods to show respect and subservience. But you also do it so that you limit your field of vision to a bit of a tunnel and reduce distractions. And this is important because if you forget a detail, if somebody distracts you, if somebody sneezes, if somebody drops something, if somebody makes a loud noise, if somebody farts, then that's part of the omen now because you're in prayer mode. So if you don't see it, it didn't happen. So by putting your toga over your head, you're going to make your life a lot easier, because one of the things that if there's a major disruption, you are expected to stop and start the ceremony all over again. And this could take a really long time and cost money, especially if you've already sacrificed some animals. One of the things that you'd have to restart for is if you got the words wrong, and that's easier to do than not, because a lot of the words to these ceremonies are from very old Latin, including words that aren't words that occur in Latin outside of these prayers. Things like, actually abracadabra is literally a Roman word that only happens in a prayer. It's used in anti-malaria rituals. You put a living fly into a little bag with a slip of paper that you've written abracadabra on. You tie it and you put it around your neck and no malaria. Don't do that. Wear mosquito netting. Take quinine. Drain standing water. Don't leave buckets out in a rainstorm. That's a good way to not get malaria. At any rate, when you see a Roman with a toga over their head, at any rate, if they're male, likely praying, and that's why this fellow has his toga over his head too, is he's not the augur, he's coming to consult the augur, and she is too. You'll notice she's got this little bowl in her hand that's tipped out. These bowls were used to pour oil or wine into flame for some gods, but also you'd take the bird seed, you'd pour it on the ground, and then the chicken would peck. So likely what she's done is she's coming, she and this guy, like a brother, a spouse, something, they're probably related, they've come to the augur and they're pouring out the seed and the bird is pecking and there's the augur. If I remember correctly, this is a commemorative relief for the augur himself, who's also, I think, a priest of Augustus. Yeah, that looks about right. So a story about what an augur could do to your day and why you might want to listen to them if you happen to be an ancient Roman. This is the story of Publius Clodius Pulcher and his chicken problem. Publius Clodius Pulcher was a Roman in charge of a fleet during the First Punic War. So this is the first war, Rome v. Carthage, and it's mostly naval engagements, couple of land battles, but we'll concentrate on the boats for now. So he's out on the water. He sees the Carthaginian fleet, but he doesn't attack immediately. Oh no. Like any good Roman who's been given command of a fleet, he stops and he pours out some bird seed for the sacred chickens to peck at. Because you don't start a battle without asking the gods how it's going to go. It's a respect thing, and it's also thought to be prudent. However, Publius Clodius did not like the answer the chickens gave him. The chickens kind of looked at the bird seed, looked at Publius Clodius, and were like, nope, 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 nope. No bird seed, not today. And the augur informs Publius Clodius, sadly, the chickens aren't eating. That's a really bad omen, because if you've met a chicken, they like to eat. So if a chicken's not eating, the gods are clearly telling you that maybe you shouldn't try to eat the other fleet today. But Publius Clodius is like, the Carthaginians are right there. Our fleet is bigger than their fleet. We can win this thing. What the heck? So he picks up the chicken coop and he screams, if they won't eat, let them drink. And then he throws them into the ocean. The battle does not go well. He loses, and this becomes a cautionary tale for Romans, that if the chickens say no, listen to the chickens. I hope that's useful information for you someday. So next up, it's not just chickens that we're looking at for communications and memos from the gods. An Etruscan tradition that gets into Roman religion really early on, that Romans go in for in a big way, is called haruspici, which is looking at internal organs, at entrails, to figure out omens and signs. So I mentioned the gods touch your sacrificial animal, and their touch can be seen on the organs. So a haruspex is somebody who professionally looks at the entrails and then tells you what the gods are trying to communicate. We are looking now at an Etruscan artifact called a liverscope. We don't know what it says entirely because it's written in Etruscan, and as I mentioned, we can't read Etruscan that well. But there are a couple of clues here. So this is the underside of a sheep's liver. These lobes are features that we regularly see when we're looking at a sheep's liver. And then the different sections are labeled, and there's a little moon shape in the middle here, so there might be some kind of a sky astrological tie-in to this. So this might have involved some applied astronomy as well as applied anatomy. So what you do is you look at the surface of the liver, and if they're like blood clots, lesions, tumors, fibrous growths, anything that isn't normal liver tissue on a healthy animal, then that's the god's handwriting. And you want to be able to read that and then report to the person offering so that you cannot tick off the gods. This was a whole science. This could be your ancient Roman job. You would enter a priestly college, you would go to haruspex school, and then your professional life would be spent waiting for a sacrificial animal to be butchered so you could look at the innards and figure out what they were trying to tell people. Sounds like it's a useful job. I could see that working out. Now for a more disturbing element of Roman religion, and that is gladiatorial competition. You may not immediately associate gladiators with religious observances, but Romans did a bit. There was a procession with images of the god at the beginning of a gladiatorial competition, and prayers afterwards. There were sacrifices. They were offered in memory of an important person, especially important dead people, and they grow out of Etruscan death rites for important upper-class Etruscan folks. This is not only an Etruscan thing, though. Ancient Greeks do this too. It's several books of the Iliad are just people doing competitions as part of the funeral thing. However, ancient Greeks don't necessarily have fights to the death at their funerals, so that's the Etruscan innovation. A gladiatorial competition is when two professional fighters, most normally enslaved, not always, but the vast majority of gladiators are enslaved people who are trafficked, trained, and made to fight each other for the entertainment of Romans at these events. Both the entertainment of the Romans and to placate the Roman gods, which makes it doubly distressing to me thinking about this as historian. A lot of the people who were made to fight as gladiators were people who were taken in war against the Romans. So you would be forced to fight other people, maybe other people who were on your same side during your war, because often these were sourced out of the same war, for gods who are not your hometown gods. And that would have been kind of problematic for me if I were an ancient person. One of the gladiatorial games, really big ones that we know about, happened in the wake of the taking of Jerusalem in 70 CE. This was the inauguration of the Colosseum, the round amphitheater in downtown Rome, which was built by enslaved labor taken in the Roman war on Judea. And then the gladiators in the first games were themselves veterans of the war in Judea. So we have Jewish monotheists forced to fight to the death to please Roman gods in the memory of dead Roman generals, which is so messed up. Like, when things haunt me at night, one of the things that does is what the final moments for these folks were like. So I actually, gladiators, yeah, are exciting, but I don't find them fun. One of the things I do love about the movie Gladiator, though, is that it leans into this. It does a pretty good job of showing how messed up gladiatorial games now were. A note about them, though, the to the death part isn't necessary. So in high profile arenas, like if you were a very well trained gladiator fighting in a major urban center at the peak time of the game, so you're not one of the early people who are doing the cheap entertainment at the beginning, you're like the feature event. If you get to that stage, then you're considered more valuable, not because you're a human being, mind you, but because it cost a lot to train you and your owner is really invested in you living. So at that point, there was a lot of care taken to extend the life of these people. Again, not for happy purposes, but so that these trafficked people could be kept alive longer to entertain Romans longer, and they'd incentivize you participating willingly. I mean, consent in this context is just not there, by holding out the hope that if you survive enough battles, you'd be given your freedom and be allowed to retire. Which is what is extra messed up about this, is that there's this incentivization to buy into the world of pro gladiatorial games, because you would be famous. You would be kind of a rock star when you were briefly allowed to walk down the streets of Rome, assuming they let you out long enough, but that's a thing. But this, I don't think, rescues the institution from being incredibly depressing for me. This is awful. It's really bad. This also becomes part of a culture of capital punishment. So one of the ways that Romans would get the best bang for their tax dollar in these games was to have the warm-up events be condemned criminals fighting each other to the death for entertainment. Not even each other, like wild animals. And all of this happens in a religious context, in a manner that one could be forgiven for mistaking for human sacrifice. Now, a Roman would be like, no, we don't do human sacrifice. That's messed up. Carthaginians do that. But other people, like, say, Carthaginians, are like, so explain to me how it's not a human sacrifice if at your religious festival you force people to bleed for your entertainment. Okay, Roman. So here is one of many I think this is a fresco showing gladiators at work, wailing on each other. Their names are up there, so we know who these folks are. This is a dude named Asiaticus. His name means from Asia Minor. And this is an artifact of this human trafficking context in which gladiators happen. This means he was likely taken from a home on the Roman borders of what's modern-day Turkey, Mesopotamia, trafficked into the empire and made to fight. Like, his name isn't even a name, it's a nickname based on where he's from. It's like calling a pro wrestler like the Russian. A little problematic. It gets more problematic still. We need to talk about the Roman triumph a bit. We're going to talk about it more later. This is another kind of religious festival that was given nominally to thank the gods for a major Roman victory in an ongoing campaign, or not ongoing, a completed campaign. It was also an incentive program for generals to succeed real good. And what you would do is you would put all of your best loot onto parade floats. Your legions would be in their armor and their fanciest stuff. The general himself would be on a ceremonial chariot wearing this fancy gold embroidered toga, and you would ride through the streets of Rome slowly, with all of the loot displayed so that everybody could ooh and ah at all of the awesome stuff that you just looted from your enemy. This comes from a piece of art commemorating one such triumph. This is the triumph following the fall of Jerusalem in 70. And here you can see the menorah from the temple being carried through the streets by Roman soldiers wearing wreaths because it's a religious function. These are the title placards, and this would have descriptions of, "This is the menorah from the temple," so that you couldn't miss the context of the looted items. This was a ritual humiliation move on the part of Romans. This is part of how they made you terrified to go to war with them, because this ceremony ended in an orgy of violence that included any leaders that Roman managed to capture being ritually murdered in the Rome's dungeon basement, the Tullianum, the Mamertine prison. This is the under basement of a prison that's already a basement, so it's a basement to a basement, where you would be strangled, or they just leave you to starve to death if they really hated you. Yeah. And at the end, the triumphing general would climb up the steps of the Capitoline Hill and sacrifice to Jupiter Optimus Maximus as a way of offering his victory to the gods and acknowledging that, okay, yeah, I'm awesome, I just got a parade, but the gods are really in charge. Okay, so let us move to lighter topics. Let's talk about Roman private rituals. So I mentioned lares, penantes. These household gods do get worshipped in your Roman house. If you're a fancy Roman, like this fancy Roman, so this is taken from a house in Pompeii. I'm over here talking about this floor plan. You'll notice there's an open space, the atrium. It's got an open roof at the center that leads into a little rain catchment basin pool here. And there are all these little office rooms and spaces around, including this front kind of shop space here. And then the shrine itself is put up right along this wall here. So it's the first thing you see before you go into the formal dining area of this house. But it's not inside the private part of the house, the penates, or the penatus. The penates are the gods of the penatus part of the house. So here is the office, and this marks the transition from the public to the private part of the house. So if you're an important Roman and you live in this house, people are going to be in and out of this door all day, and they're going to come to your office, and they're going to talk to you about their business, and you're going to do your stuff, but eventually you're going to retreat back into the porticus. There's a little garden out in the back. There are all these little rooms, the kitchen. So this is the back end of the house. This is where you sleep. This is where you eat. This is where your family hangs out. You can tell where this person's priorities are at. There's a lot more front of the house than back of the house. I think this might be the Vedae brothers. It's a very upwardly mobile bachelor pad going on here. But you do get much larger back of the house. Even if you're living in a one-room apartment, as most Romans are, most Romans can't afford this kind of house. They're living, if they're in the city, they're in large apartment buildings where an entire family is living in a single room. You would still have a shrine, and your shrine looks like this. It looks like a miniature temple, right? There are two columns, and then there's this fake porch here. And then you put your household gods here. You get little statues of them, and you make your offerings to them there, and there'll be some art on the back. In apartment buildings in Pompeii, we find, Pompeii and Herculaneum, we found these things, charred wood mini shrines that are about like this big, like a dollhouse-sized shrine that you would keep your gods in. You could open and close the door so they could see or not see, depending. And there are other cultures that do this too. You see this in Shinto households sometimes, so this is still an ongoing thing. Neo-pagans have these as well, as do some kinds of Christians. Eastern Orthodox Christians often have a household shrine with icons in it. You also sometimes see this in devout Roman Catholic households. Besides, it's not gone away. This is still a pretty normal practice globally, even though you don't see it in a lot of American homes, but some. Oh, and I shouldn't leave Hindus out. You also find this in Hindu households a lot. And there is some influence. Indian immigrants were a part of the urban landscape in the Mediterranean in large enough numbers that there are little communities where we see clusterings of artifacts that are imports from India. We've found an ivory statue of the goddess Lakshmi, for instance, in Pompeii. So yeah, you do get some household shrines that include gods from every corner of the empire. Again, it's a really diverse world, and that diversity is on full display in your household shrine. Okay, so the next slide I'm going to tell you before I go there, in case like you've got little kids hanging around and I just don't want to spring this on you without any warning. We're about to look at something that is going to be very different between Roman religion and piety and most American religious practices. There are some American religions where you get imagery like this. So we're going to be looking at some Roman representations of erect phalluses. So just kind of get yourself in a place where you're okay looking at these things, because we've got to talk about them. These are very important to Romans. They're a big deal. And if you're remotely familiar with Roman arts and artifacts, you have likely been surprised by one of these. So let's talk about them. Okay, so the next slide, it's coming. You ready? Ready? Okay. Priapus is a god who's associated with the fascinum. The fascinum is the disembodied phallus shape. So I'm going to talk about Priapus first and use that as my entry point to talk about why Romans are always putting the fascinum on things. It might not be what you think it is. So Priapus is a god whose main characteristic you can notice by looking at him. Here he is. That's Priapus. You'll notice that he's standing with a bowl of fruit, or maybe you didn't notice the bowl of fruit because you were busy looking at his other physical feature. You may also notice that his appendage is being weighed on a scale. On the other side is this bag. There's a caption on this picture. So this is at the entrance of that house we were just looking at a minute ago, the house of the Vettii brothers. So this is on the outside of the house, right by the front door. There is no way you wouldn't see this when you were coming inside the house. And this is not for shock value. This is very normal. This is the normal place to put this god and this imagery. Because this god's whole deal is that he, well, I mean, you can see he has his appendage, and it's also perpetually erect, and he threatens people with it. He's a god of property protection, and the way he protects your property is by scaring off bad vibes with an unsolicited dick pic. And this is the relatable part. Nobody likes that. Ask first. Consensual dick pics, like, great, knock yourself out, but don't just lead with it. I think we all know this, but I'm just putting it out there. But even Romans thought that, no, that's a threatening gesture. The interesting thing about Priapus's mythology is that although he's threatening people with being raped by his giant phallus, he's got a problem. Whenever he goes to follow through, he deflates. So there's some embarrassment narrative going on with this god too, and there's a lot of Roman playful poetry dedicated to the god Priapus that's used to release a lot of erection adjacent anxiety. Now sometimes you'll hear Priapus called a fertility god, and sort of, but not in the way you think. And that's why I'm not just telling you that thing about his erection issues for shock value. It's an important plot point. He's not a fertility god in that his extra large appendage is able to get more things pregnant. He's not that kind of fertility god. That's not what the phallus is for. Rather, he protects your fruit from things that would come and mess with it. So like birds eating your grain or pecking at your fruit, worms, bugs, but mainly the main thing that's scared off by Priapus's phallus is the evil eye. So what's up with the evil eye? This is a pan-Mediterranean thing, still is. You can still get representations of a glass blue eye that you wear, and it's kind of like fighting fire with fire. Wearing the eyeball scares off the evil eye. So the idea of the evil eye is a little complicated. Either it's, well, it's kind of a both either. It starts with this idea that there are certain people whose eyeballs are just a little bit different, and those differences come with an increased ability to cause people harm, and that this harm is triggered by that person looking at you with envy. Like if they see you and they don't like that you're doing well, it's not even that they want your stuff necessarily. It's like they look at you and they're like, I hate that you have that thing. So it's kind of an evil mashup between hatred and envy and loathing, and they hate you and they don't want you to have nice things. As time and cultural mishmash goes on, it's thought that this happens not only when people with special eyeballs look at you and don't want you to have nice things, but just anybody who looks at you and is like, why do they have that gaze can harm. And they're not wrong there. That emotion, that kind of like angry, I hate that you have nice stuff, does what, or rather can cause damage. I mean, I will admit to having some feelings about the Kardashians having a lot of money. Like, why? I work really hard. I'm entertaining. Why don't I have that kind of money, for instance? So, maybe the Kardashians should be worried about me looking at them, and they should invest in some Foskeenum jewelry. Okay, so Foskeenum jewelry takes the active ingredient in the god Priapus and makes it into a bit of wearable jewelry, which is what we're looking at here mostly, although you can also put them on carvings. Sometimes you'll see hybrid creatures that are half goat, half phallus, and this is because goats are associated with increased erectile activity. If you've met a goat, you'll understand. But also roosters, so male chickens, are associated with this kind of thing. The pun cock works in Latin and in English, because, a gallus, although it doesn't work in quite the same way, just kind of go with this here. So sometimes you will see these hybrids of, it's a cock that's also a cock. I'm not saying that to be gross. I'm saying that because that's what the Roman artist is thinking and channeling here. And you'll also notice that this particular Foskeenum here at the top, like it's got the little wings, and then it's got these rooster feet that are also snatching up other Foskeena, so that there are multiple phallic images on this thing. So this is like an extra dominant Foskeenum that's extra threatening. So you want this to be as threatening as possible because it's scaring off the evil eye. These are more budget options. So this one I quite like because it's got the Foskeenum on the one side, and then on the other side it's got this fist making a rude gesture, which gives you more of an idea of the kind of vibe that we're going for here. So who would wear these things? You'll notice they've got these little rings. That's because you'd wear these as a necklace. Everybody. This is something that you'd get your nice elderly Roman grandma because you wanted her to be protected from bad vibes. This is something that you would put around your baby because you were worried about infant mortality. So one of the things that you'd worry about is people look at your babies and they're like, why is your baby so healthy? And then your baby might get evil eye cursed and then die. Like, how do you cope with that kind of existential dread for your children? Because even though ancient people commonly lost their children to early death, it didn't mean they didn't love their kids. Like, it didn't mean they were any less attached. Romans were constantly processing this fear that their babies were going to die, and that was really hard. So one of the ways they coped is they'd put a foscinum on their baby's neck because they love that kid. They want that kid to be protected from all of the incoming hatred and envy, potentially from parents whose kids had died and they were just upset and grieving and not thinking. So it protects you, it protects parents who've suffered a loss. It's just better for your community if you have a foscinum on your kid's neck. So kids would wear multiples of these things around their neck, and they'd teeth on them, they'd chew on them. And because teething was associated with this period of heightened danger, because this is also the time about when you're weaning, and when you wean, you're no longer drinking breast milk, so you're being exposed to unsafe food, and your immune system hasn't developed fully, so it's a dangerous time when you're around 2 in the ancient Mediterranean. So little 2-year-olds would be like on their foscinum all the time, and it was a cute thing. So when Romans see this, they're not like, in the same way that Americans tend to. Like, Americans still draw this on walls, but we're not doing it to protect anybody. We're doing it because we're like, ha, let's put something really offensive on this wall. Romans aren't trying to do that to you. That's not what they mean. When you're seeing a foscinum, you're seeing an expression of care, of love, and not like the sexy kind of love. This is the love that knows that something you love can die. And this is how Romans cope. So when you're looking at one of these things, you're seeing Romans at their most vulnerable and their most human. And that's something I always think about when I see the foscinum, as I see Romans doing their best to protect people that they care deeply about. And even though there's some aggression in this story, it's, not Jupiter pretending to be your friend who is also a duck and then, like, raping you. This isn't that story. This is just, chasing people off with an unsolicited dick pic, which, okay, I can't make the case that that's completely wholesome, and I'm not doing that here. But this is kind of sweet, and that's the note I'm going to end this on, is these Romans really care, and these Romans are really worried, and they're doing their very, very best to keep this evil eye from attacking their family. All right, that's it. Stay tuned for more when we do the info dump about early Roman history. Not as long as this one, though. This one's a monster. I'm sorry. Hope it was interesting, though. Peace.